So what are we going to do today is that Ariel is going to start about giving a general introduction, a brief introduction about some of the global initiatives. We have been talking in the past 2 days about the Sustainable Development Goals and the universal health coverage. So we are not going to discuss in detail, but just to set the scene, what does it mean for indigenous population. And after that, we're going to have Jonathan Fox. He's going to talk to us about the safeguards within the World Bank, specifically for the indigenous population. What are they, what does it mean, and how they can be used as a strategy to address rights violation of indigenous population whenever there is a World Bank project. And we're going to finalize the panel with Ofelia and with Alberto from Mozambique, and they're going to talk to us about a specific strategy, which is legal empowerment, to address these kind of issues. After the presentations, we're going to have a group work to reflect about, from these strategies and some others that you have learned about during these 3 days, which ones do you think would be relevant for your own context? And also, what sort of support do you think that you may need, or inputs from other colleagues to be able to implement those strategies? And we're going to discuss the possibility of continue, as we as a group that can collaborate among each other, being virtually or in different ways, because we are interested in advancing this discussion. Okay? With that introduction, Ariel, please.
Well, we already have been speaking a lot, I think, around universal health coverage and the Sustainable Development Goals. They are well-intended aspirations to ensure health for all. That's the main purpose, as it is being described. However, as we have heard in the morning, I'm not going to repeat it, universal health coverage concept and approach is being deviating too much to the financial issues, and is somehow under the idea of the public system cannot resolve all the problems. Somehow it's also turning the face, from my point of view, too excessively, without capacities to do it, to the private sector. So somehow, at least in Peru, there's the denounce that the system is failing, then the private sector is going to do it better. But at which cost? And which is the main purpose of the private sector? Sustainable Development Goals face similar challenges from my point of view, but it added the idea of the integrality, because universal health coverage is driven also by the package, and it's usually a package of health care, recuperative care. Sustainable Development Goals should give an overall landscape integral approach, but at least in many Latin American countries, those that should work together, they are just like isolated, fragmented, working differently and with different logics, and that's a challenge that should be made. In general, I will just mention that there's a gap, big gap between the norms and the laws, the international commitments, the norms and the laws that should reflect them, and the implementation that happens in the countries. One day I said that the problem in Peru, at least, is international commitments that are not respected, laws that are not accomplished, policies that don't get implemented, well implemented, and managers who don't manage. What could we do facing this landscape? And as I said, it seems complex, it seems difficult, but there have been many initiatives from civil society and communities themselves that have tried to address this, and I think it's the moment to learn from them, and it's the moment to be brave and propose new things that give light to many things that are happening behind our society, to give light so the society could react, and I hope they will react.
The backstory goes back to the 1970s and 80s. the first indigenous protest movement to actually prevent a World Bank funded project from moving forward was in the northern Philippines, around the Chico River Dam, back in the 1970s, even during the dictatorship of Marcos. A strong unified indigenous movement prevented their communities from being flooded and destroyed by a dam project. And then the next wave was in the late 80s, early 90s with the Narmada movement in India in particular. Also during the 80s we had a lot of protests around the World Bank backing for the paving of roads into the Amazon forest, which attracted global attention. The burning of the Amazon is not new. This was going back to the 1980s that came to global attention. And what happened with the campaign, first for compensation and then against the Narmada Dam, which is an ongoing struggle, had an effect which is common to many protest campaigns around the world regarding the World Bank, which is that the people who are doing the work for the protests, who are shedding their blood, sweat, and tears, often actually win very little. But they push the institution to carry out some policy reforms that make it somewhat less likely that other peoples, other communities in other parts of the world will be similarly affected and oppressed. So this is a really very perverse effect, that the people who are doing the work of the struggle are not always the people who enjoy whatever wins or whatever benefits. Because what happens with policy reforms is that they very rarely provide any kind of compensation or redress to the people who are affected, but they can help to introduce new policies that can have a preventative effect in the future somewhere else. And I think it's useful to think in terms of two kinds of effects. There's the damage mitigation effect, and then there's a damage prevention effect. And then there's a third kind of effect where under certain rare circumstances, the role of a multilateral organization like the World Bank can support the actual creation of positive spaces. This has happened at least a few times in the case of World Bank projects, and I've personally been looking back historically at the 90s, cases in Ecuador and in Colombia where certain allies within the World Bank actually created space for collective land titling and so forth. And essentially the protests around the world have sometimes empowered insider reformists, particularly non-economists, sometimes anthropologists who've been working from the inside. And when that protest from below and insider reformers manage to come together, sometimes that can make some partial difference. So just to sum up, there are one of the challenges with such a big, faraway institution is how to figure out where are the entry points, where is their leverage. And here I think the key elements are to learn what the minimum standards are, what are the minimum commitments that the institution itself makes, and then to complement that with how to strengthen the independent monitoring of what the World Bank and its governmental allies are actually doing. As I'm sure many of you know, the World Bank doesn't operate directly, they fund governments to operate directly, so when the community sees the bulldozer coming, it's usually not obvious whether or not the World Bank is behind the bulldozer, because there are many layers of the government in between what's going on the ground and the World Bank. So the challenge here is to connect the dots, to figure out what are the different links in the chain of decision making in order to identify where might there be some pressure points. But the basic idea of understanding this document and expose hypocrisy. When we can document hypocrisy, when they are failing to meet their own commitments, and when we can bring that evidence to bear with advocacy pressure, that can create some leverage in the World Bank, but figuring out how to deploy that evidence is another channel. Which parts of the World Bank are more vulnerable to that kind of pressure? Which parts of the World Bank might have some allies, and which parts are completely closed and not interested? And so that involves getting inside the black box of this big and opaque institution.
NAMAT is based with legal empowerment, and we strengthen the community. So we support the community by defensores de saúde. Some countries call it defensores de saúde or Paralegals, yes. And we started to work in 2013. And we also support health communities. We train them in police and protocol health. And we are working together with support Minister of Health in Mozambique. And we also have partner like Universidade Eduardo Galeani and other partners we call Centro de Práticas Jurídicas. We also support health providers. We strengthen them to improve their kind of work. So in Mozambique, as we were seeing, there is too many laws, but these laws is only in the papers. It doesn't work properly, and the lack of and the gap of implementation is a lack of information, because many people in Mozambique are living in rural area where information are not enough, and also the people there in Mozambique they have a culture of silence. They are free always to claim for their rights, and they see the health providers as the one who are there to make a favor to them, and also when they claim for their rights, no one is there to support them. No one is there to give them an answer. So NAMAT also draws on a case data to advocates for system change that can impact the entire populations. A few examples we can see here: adoption of a national strategy to combat bereavement in the health sectors, development of an in-service patients' rights, curricula for training health providers across the country. So also supporting the Minister of Health to create patients' rights office at various health facilities in Mozambique, including developing and training package of operations guide. We have also a tools which call it ferramenta de levantamento dos desafios, where we can report all the challenges we find in the community and also in health facilities. So we can see that in that tools which one we have solved it and which one are continuing, and which strategy we can take up in order to resolve that big challenge.
Thank you very much. All very interesting presentations. I had a question for Ariel. I was interested, you mentioned the long delay between the law and the norm, but it sounds like two important cases where there was a law and then nothing happened within a very short space of time. Recently, the norm came. Can you tell us a little bit about what was happening politically and what was civil society's action to make the norm finally happen after more than 10 years in one case?
On the question of the relationship between these international standards and national laws, this is a very much of a gray area, because depending on the state of national laws, sometimes the national laws are better than the World Bank standards, and sometimes the World Bank standards are better than the national laws, and so that creates either advocacy opportunities or challenges depending on what's going on. The official, so this document here is called the Guidance Note for Borrowers, meaning this is the way the World Bank explains to the national governments that are borrowing their money, what does it mean to actually follow these rules? So what is, when it comes to free, prior, and informed consent, who decides who is a legitimate representative to be consulted? And one of the challenges here is that, given that, like many multilateral organizations, they are often very in favor of decentralization. Often the middle and lower levels of governments are not friends of indigenous peoples. They may be controlled by the main enemies of indigenous peoples, and so sometimes there are perverse effects when the World Bank is funding, for example, providing governments with social funds for municipal governments. sometimes those municipal governments are very, very unfriendly. And so that's an example of a perverse effect. And so one of the broader questions is, who decides whether this policy is triggered at all in the first place? But I should say one of the key issues involves land, and in some cases the World Bank supports agribusiness and privatization. In other cases, they support collective land titling to recognize ancestral domain. It depends on the particular country, the moment in history, and how strong the advocacy campaigns are at a given time and place.